So that is that picture, and we're going to do a couple of things applied to this picture just as the start of the image down here. So let's go through a couple of different things that are in the lighting effects download. And the reason why I have that sitting in front of me right now is because I reference this all the time at home. And so I'm going to do the same thing here. Like I said yesterday a million times, I don't have a memory, which is probably why I said it a million times. But I need to look at this. I need this because I need a reference whenever I'm editing. So I'm going to open up my lighting effects, and the first thing that I see here is gradients. So let's talk about gradients a little bit. Now, if I want to add a gradient to this picture, what is the pro and con to doing that? There isn't really a con if you know how to work with a gradient, but gradients are a little bit confusing sometimes because within a gradient you have certain limitations. I mean, the point of a gradient is that you want color on one side and then another color or nothing on the other, so it's going to fade, which is really kind of an awesome thing if you're working with a sky, if you're working with adding color maybe to the top portion of an image. That's how I like to work with it most often. So let's go ahead and find our clouds layer here. We'll pop that on, and I'm going to create a gradient here. So the first way that I want to do that is to go to Layer, and then New Fill Layer. So we're going to play with two things within Layer, New Fill Layer. One will be Gradient, and one will be Solid Color. You can also play with Pattern if you want. So if I click Pattern, you'll see that basically you just need to find a pattern. I mean, there's no other reason to do that except to find a pattern. So instead, I'm just going to go to Solid Color and Gradient because those are the other options that you have. So solid color, you can fill in an entire color over your image, and then you can play with that color, fade it, layer mask it, do whatever you need to do to that, and same with gradient. So let's go ahead and go into gradient. And what we're going to see here is that we can choose a color if we want. So let's say yellow, because we know we want sort of a warm hue to this picture. Mode. This is something that we'll talk about in just a moment. So we'll keep the mode on normal for right now, and then we say OK. But now we have this weird gradient happening, right? We have these options that we get, so I can change the gradient. We can see all sorts of really weird things happening here. And I don't like playing with these at all. I don't really find a lot of use in them. So instead, I'm going to cancel that, and then we'll just say OK. All right, so what I have here is a gradient that is ignoring my color because it's pulling from my colors palette here. So if it's ignoring my color and pulling from the color palette, then I need to go ahead and change that first. So I'm clicking on my little color swatches, and I'm going to make this slider give me a yellow, sort of yellow-red. I think that would be kind of nice. Something like that, because I am looking here to get this nice yellow hue. So if you're looking at this color and you're like, oh my gosh, that is so bright, and you're about to make a big mistake, you might be right. But I'm also going to lower the opacity on that layer. So let's just try with a nice bright color first, and we'll get rid of that gradient fill layer. And we'll go back down to our clouds, and now we'll do this process again of going to Layer, New Fill Layer, Gradient, and say OK. So now it's automatically selecting that yellow color that we've just plugged in here. We can play with the angle of this. So if I want just the sky to have that gradient on it, we can do that. I can change the angle maybe like this, so then there's sort of a light burst coming from that area, which again is what we want to do. Reverse. You probably don't want to do that because you can already do that with the angle. So unless you think, I changed my mind, I just want to totally flip it, you can do that. I always align it with the layer. And I think that looks pretty good. So let's say OK to that. Now we have something to work with. It's not the best thing that we've ever seen to work with, but let's go ahead and just make some adjustments. So one thing that you can do is lower the opacity on the layer. That's something that we can always do, works very, very nicely. If you double click, you can always get back into that dialog box. So if you're thinking, oh, I don't like the angle of it, you can still change that. So that's not something that's permanent. But I'm going to cancel that. So OK, I kind of like it, it's all right, but maybe I want to make some adjustments. So I want to instead go to my blending modes. So now I can start to change my blending mode. So when I click a blending mode, that is telling the layer that you're clicked on how to interact with the layers below it. So I can start to try a lot of different things on this gradient that we've just put on. So lighten, you can see that it's creating sort of a hazy look when we choose that. Darken, you can see that that's almost doing the opposite of what we want, and then it's adding a little bit of cyan color in there. And let's see, let's play with some others. Overlay, I love overlay. I think that's a really beautiful option because it keeps the contrast in the clouds and in the background. So overlay is really nice as well. So let's just say we're gonna stick to overlay for the moment. And we have this gradient, and you can see how it's brightening everything up. Well, because we have added this as an adjustment layer here, we automatically have a layer mask attached to that gradient. So that means that we can go ahead with our brush, just like we did yesterday, make sure that we're on black with our color swatches. And I'm going to use my left square bracket to make that a little bit smaller and take the opacity down on the brush. So the reason why I just did all of those things is because I'm going to be erasing, so I need to be on black. The opacity of my brush, I don't want to erase the gradient altogether. I just want to make it a little bit less in certain areas. For example, on her hair, it's getting a little bit bright for my taste compared to the background, so I might erase it off of her hair just a little bit. So let's go ahead and erase that just off the hair there. And you can see when I do that, I'm accidentally erasing too much, and that's why it's so good that we have a layer mask. So I can always just take that size down of my brush, take the opacity back up. X on the keyboard will switch to black and white, back and forth between there, and I can just color that gradient back in wherever I think it needs to be. So if I zoom out, I can see here now what I've done with that gradient. We've added a lot of color to this image. We've also added it more in a certain part than another. So let me explain why I would want to use this or not want to use this depending on your workflow. Now, let's say that you're thinking, well, okay, you just did a gradient and that was kind of a lot of work for a really simple effect. Okay, I get that. But we can do something where we have a little bit more control over how much light and color we're adding. So I'm going to take away that gradient just for right now. And now I'm going to go to Layer, New Fill Layer, Solid Color. Now we already have our color swatch down here, so we're just going to go with that as the same color. Now we have mode, so if you already know what mode you want to use, then you can go ahead and choose that now. You don't have to wait till later. But I like to use normal because then I can change it if I want to, but then I can see what it really looks like when it's at full opacity and everything is stuck on top of that image. So I'll say okay. So what do we have? We have a yellow square. That's it. We have a yellow square because what we have just done is create a layer on normal with just fill of a color. So I'll say okay, I'll bite that, and we can lower the opacity on that layer. And this is just a really nice way of having more control with a layer mask. So instead of it doing the gradient for you and determining how much to erase or how much to fade, in this case, we can just click on our layer mask, and now we have a lot more control over how much this is affecting our image. So, ooh, that was a big brush. I'm gonna take that brush a little bit smaller. And I'm going to go into my opacity to lower the opacity on my brush so that I'm not erasing everything. I want a nice smooth transition here. On black, and now I can just erase it where I don't want it. So we've essentially done the same effect. We have just gotten rid of the outside edges a little bit, and we can keep going with that if we want. If I want, I can make that brush smaller. And now, in terms of what we've done to our subject and how that sort of solid color is now affecting, it's going to look pretty similar to the gradient. So that's the gradient, which we have on overlay, so it's not quite the same blending mode, versus this solid color. It is doing the same thing, but solid color allows you to bring back more of the color if you've erased too much or if you don't like how the gradient is shifting there. So we can again play with our blending modes. We can go down to overlay again, and that's going to have an effect on our image, just in the same way that that gradient did. Now, if I wanted to make it match exactly, I could just take the opacity up a little bit more. And then we've got essentially the same thing happening. I'm just toggling between the two, and they look almost identical, just based on where I didn't erase or where I did erase. Yeah?
Do you inherently know, like, I know that in the different blending modes, like certain colors do certain things, and that's kind of mathy to me, and I can't keep that straight. Do you know that, like, inherently, or do you just try stuff?
I try everything.
Yeah, me too.
I mean, on a regular basis, I will try to think, what does lighten mean and what does darken mean? And then I'll just say, oh, forget it, I'll just try them and see what they do, because I have a hard time keeping stuff like that straight. And with color especially, it works differently than some other things. So for example, I never use overlay as a blending mode, almost never. But with color, I do, because of the way it makes it stick. You know, it maintains the contrast, and I'm kind of looking for that. But yeah, I just try everything. I think I've kind of got lighten and darken down now, but that's about it. So yeah, I just try everything. I'm going to go to normal now on this color fill layer, and the reason why I would want to do that, if that's sort of the look I'm going for, is because it does add a haziness over the whole image, which changes the light. So if we were to blend this with, let's go back down to overlay, then that is maintaining the contrast. If it's maintaining the contrast, we have to think about what that means for the light. So if there is contrast, then that means that the light is not becoming more hazy or anything like that. But I want to add a little bit of a flare coming in from that side to make the light look like it's filling the space. So that's why I would want to switch overlay to normal. And so when I switch overlay to normal, yes, it becomes hazier, and yes, we have this sort of, I don't know, I guess sort of matte look to it now. There's not a lot of contrast, and we can fix that in certain places, but I really like how that's looking. So this is something that I do from time to time, is to create now an adjustment layer. We'll just go to curves to keep consistency here. And now we can sort of play with what that looks like by pinning it to the layer right below. So now I can play with that overlay layer, and you can start to make more adjustments to it if you want. I could make it redder if I want, just by adding that curve and pinning it to the layer below. So that's something that I'm really interested in doing, something that makes me, or allows me to have more control over, you know, that specific layer that I just stuck on there. So I don't like fill layers and gradients especially so much, because it can be a little bit hard to change the color, but if you can pin your curve or however you like to make adjustments to that layer, then it becomes a separate step. And I work like that. I have lots of layers when I work, because I work in very small pieces. So for me, I don't like to then go back in and say, okay, well, I'm going to change this color now, and I'm going to do this, which you can absolutely do. It's easy to do that. But once I've made an adjustment, I like for that adjustment to stay there. And then I like to make more changes on top of that. And that's just, I guess, a weird brain thing, but that's just how I work.